Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast, the show that inspires you to change and live a more exciting life. My name is Ishmael, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or topic that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life, individually and collectively. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. In today's episode, I have the great privilege to talk to Dr. Maike Neuhaus. And first of all, we laughed a lot. We really had a good and fun time. And we talk about the emergence of positive psychology and universal components of mental health. We also discuss if the time is in fact ready for a more collectivistic approach, and we talk about the power of self-leadership and self-knowledge. We further elaborate on how important it is that you understand your strength and your values and how to do so. We discuss the power of asking questions, and we discuss a few facts and figures about motivation you likely don't know yet. We talk about self-trust and defining goals, and on how to create self-assurance. Further, we talk about 3 ingredients, namely autonomy, competence, and relatedness, that each and every one of us needs in order to motivate ourselves. And I really hope that you can take away some of the practical tools that we have discussed. And with that, I want to give you a warm welcome, Maike, to the Just Another Mindset podcast. I'm very excited that you're here today, calling in from Australia. And my first question would be, how do you feel today and what's on your mind?
Oh, that's a nice question. And thank you so much for having me, Ismail. I am actually feeling quite chill today, I suppose. My day's been quite calm. And what's on my mind? I'm preparing currently a mini intervention for a women's leadership sort of group on Saturday. So I'm just, it's the first time I'm running it in that format. And so that's where my mind is sort of circulating because I've been working on them this afternoon.
Wonderful. That sounds super interesting. How many women are you going to work with, or how many are you preparing this for?
I think it depends. I'm not quite sure exactly how many of them are going to show up, but it's only a very small group. It's actually a leadership course I'm myself a participant in. I think we're like a group of 8 or something like that. So yeah, quite intimate, and yeah, amazing women in that group. So it's a privilege.
That sounds, it sounds like, is that, if I may ask, is that like different leaders from Australia, or is that different leaders from around the world who are also into coaching and into psychology? Or how did you guys meet and decide to have this masterclass, if you want to call it?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually a group that with women from all over the world. I suppose probably most of them are located in the US. And it's a new program. I don't know if I should plug it, but it's a new program by Katrin Schöndorf. She used to be the CEO of Mercer in Switzerland. She's now working for herself, and it's like her mission to get more women into the C-suite. And so she developed this leadership program for women. And yeah, I'm participating in that. And it's just that last time we spoke, I made a comment and then had a couple of follow-up questions from some of the other women. And somehow, yeah, one of them proposed, why don't you do a little mini intervention with us on your topic? Because I was talking about flourishing and how important it is. And so here we are. I'm just preparing for that. I'm doing a little mini intervention with them on Saturday, making sure they're flourishing.
Wonderful. That sounds super interesting. So you help people flourishing and you're into leadership. And maybe before we go into details of that a little bit more, maybe we can share a little bit of your story also with our audience. What brought you where you are? When doing some research on your person, I wrote about emotional roller coasters, but I also read about a lot of happiness that you have nowadays. So maybe you just want to invite us on a little trip on, who is Maike?
Wow. Well, look, emotional roller coaster. I'm trying to remember what I wrote, but I suppose I was probably writing about my own career because. So what's always fascinated me from a very young age, I remember this so clearly, was the fact that some people seem to thrive in life while others seem to struggle from one hurdle to the next. They seem to bang their head against the wall and then complain about the walls. And it's always struck me as just fascinating. I was wondering, what is it that these people have that the others don't? Or what is it that they do that the others don't do? And I also very vividly remember people telling me about their regrets. So adults telling me about their regrets, saying things like, oh, if I were your age again, I would also learn how to ice skate, learn another language, or pack up and go traveling with a family, or whatever, you name it. And, when I asked them, well, why don't you do that now? They would always say something like, oh, no, I'm too, old. I have too many responsibilities. I don't have enough money. And I swore to myself in my young years already, I don't ever want to do that. I was actually fascinated by people who reported about near-death experiences or traumas they had that kind of almost like flicked a switch for them that made them really appreciate life and live every day to the fullest. And I was always very much inspired by that. And I've always asked myself, how can I ensure that I live like that? I wanted to live like that. I wanted to live every single day like it was my last. But how can I do that without the trauma and a near-death experience, if you wish? So to make a long story short, I studied psychology after school, not really with a particular career ambition, but because for me that was the most natural thing to study. I wanted to learn about how humans tick, how our minds work, what makes humans, feel pulled towards something, how does motivation work, how do we best accomplish our goals, build new habits. That sort of stuff has always fascinated me. And then later on, I started working in research, and that was mainly because at the time, the only way the knowledge of psychology was used in a positive way was in either in organizational psychology, and I worked as an organizational psychologist for a while, still while we lived in Germany, or in health psychology. So health psychology is a lot about helping individuals or mostly groups of people adopt healthier lifestyle behaviors. So they were like the only disciplines at the time where psychology was applied in a positive way, rather than looking at what's wrong with people, going, wow, how can we really help people to thrive in a particular way? And that sort of in those years is actually a subdiscipline now of psychology that sort of developed over those years. That's called positive psychology. It really looks at what do human beings need in order to thrive, in order to be deeply happy, not just cheery or cheerful every day, but deeply or authentically happy. What do we need to be able to say at the end of the day, I've lived a really good life, or I lived my life to the fullest? So there's now a whole subdiscipline of psychology and of research devoted to that. And so that's only developed over the last sort of 20 years, very slowly, but it's fascinating. And so I worked in health psychology or health behavior change research for a while, for many years. And at some stage, I was noticing that I was getting increasingly frustrated. I wasn't quite sure why, because I knew, to the best of my knowledge, I had always taken the best sort of next step for myself, and in terms of what career opportunities there were for me. But one day I was so frustrated that I basically came home from work and I thought, this is ridiculous, Maike. I think I need to start fresh. I sat down with a pen and paper and I started writing down everything that's ever fascinated me about well, psychology in general, or I basically asked myself if I had to start over again, what would I study? Would I even study? And my answer very quickly was psychology. And so I wrote down all the most fascinating bits that I loved so much about psychology and everything I'd learned. And I ended up basically writing a workshop. And I looked at this workshop and I just thought to myself, this is exactly what I want to be teaching people for the rest of my life. So somehow I knew that I needed a career change. I knew that at the time there weren't really jobs out there that covered that, because what it covered was human behavior change, which is what I specialized in. It covered positive psychology, which now, by the way, I lecture also at the University of Queensland here. And it covered something I discovered then, which is self-leadership, because there's a whole research field covering self-leadership and what that is. And this research field, funnily enough, doesn't even talk to psychology much yet. So I combined the three of them into a workshop, and I started teaching it locally here in Brisbane. I started developing retreats. I now have an online course and I coach people. And this is the stuff I love the most. So I suppose that for me was a little bit of an emotional roller coaster, definitely, because chief happiness officers didn't exist at the time. Positive psychology barely existed at the time. So there weren't a lot of opportunities, I suppose. So you couldn't even see them. And I could feel that I needed something else. But when you can't see what you need, it's hard to define that.
Yeah, I think it also requires quite a bit of trust in yourself and your person to still accept that a change is in fact needed, and to sit down, take that sheet of paper and to start writing down, and what comes to mind will eventually be a workshop, or will eventually be a presentation, or will eventually be a business model whatsoever. But it also requires some trust in yourself. So thank you very much for sharing that journey. And before we go into self-leadership and self-coaching, so two distinct areas that you specialize in, because I find it very interesting what you just said, this positive psychology, because I am aware, not to the extent that you are, but that it's psychology in its more traditional understanding rather looked at problems and how to solve human behavior. I'm fairly aware that this is not the right terminology, but on a high level. When and why do you think that changed? And you say now there is a whole branch of positive psychology. It's an own stream. It's big, right? I mean, if you look into social media, if you look into normal media, happiness, positivity, all that is big. So why do you think this stream of psychology evolved, if you have a perspective on that? And why do you feel yourself being such a good fit for it?
I love your question. So basically, I mean, human beings have always had an interest in what makes life worth living. What is a good life? You can go back to ancient Greece and probably even further back in history, and there would have been people sort of dealing with that. But ancient Greek philosophers have been dealing with that question, Aristotle, Socrates, and so forth. In terms of the psychology discipline, yes, you said very well. Traditionally, it used to sort of have that clinical focus. It used to look at psychopathology, and even to this day, we still think, when we think about mental health, right, we think of not having a mental illness. We actually think of mental illness when we talk about mental health. It's a big problem. Because we now know that in order to be mentally healthy or completely mentally healthy, we need more than the absence of mental illness. Same as being physically healthy, we need more than the absence of fractures, right? So there's always been this interest. There has also been some of this interest among some psychologists years ago. So Carl Rogers, for example, was a big one. There have been roots sort of all over the place for positive psychology, but the official, if you will, maybe start of positive psychology came with Martin Seligman. So Martin Seligman is a very famous psychologist. And he became the president of the American Psychological Association, I think in 98 or maybe 2000, I always forget. And that was basically his big agenda to shift within psychology, because it was long acknowledged amongst psychologists, I suppose, that it wasn't balanced. It was only ever looking at what's wrong with people. And there was the desire to start looking at more at what's right with people, or what goes well in people when they are living a really good life, right? Or when they would say that, yeah, they're flourishing mentally. So when they have high levels of mental well-being. And so he really pushed the agenda, and he's a very good brand strategist and marketer, apart from the fact that he's a psychologist. So he managed, I think, to pull in a lot of funding for more research, and kind of started from there and kind of explored it from there as well, because of the interest and because it resonates really well with people. I should say that it also meant that it kind of developed a little bit of an extreme, if you will. So toxic positivity is one of those topics there. It's not about, being happy, cheery all the time and being happy all the time. So positive psychology has gone through a few waves in its development, and also has acknowledged that it's not about trying to be happy and ignoring our negative feelings. It's actually now quite balanced, or it's trying to be inclusive and balanced, and looking at just simply what do we need in order to be deeply or authentically happy and lead a good life. And that covers a lot of different areas. Yeah, and I don't know if you would like to go into detail into any of those areas in particular, but it includes all those things like hedonic well-being, or feeling mostly well in life, but also eudaimonia, so that deep sense of happiness where we feel like we're living our purpose, we live a life of meaning, but also things like being well connected socially and feeling like we contribute to something bigger than ourselves, feeling like we grow as a person and we can self-actualize and spread our wings and those sorts of things. So there's quite a bit involved in that, and I think it's absolutely fascinating and a beautiful discipline.
No, absolutely. And it sounds very interesting because, I mean, if you think of any other industry, I mean, this is quite a shakeup. So it only makes sense that there was different waves going up, going into extremes. But what I understand from your description is that now it basically found its common demeanor, and that you have agreement in the community, and then you have certainly different specialities. So if you talk about those different components of mental health, I just want to call them, is there a degree of universality to those? Is there something that you can say, okay, like Ishmael and any other person is certainly striving to give some meaning, or Ishmael should have this hedonic, like, is that something that's true for most of us at least, or is that something that's still very specific for different individuals?
That's a very good question. I would say obviously there's a lot of research studies that's behind these constructs. And of course, these research studies are conducted with many different people of all, let's say, genders and ethnicities and socioeconomic statuses and so forth, and in different countries. It really depends a little bit. I think some of the constructs are researched a bit better than others. So there's always more research you can do. There will always be some groups of people that have not been included in some of the research. In general, research in psychology always aims to be able to generalize findings to whatever target group it applies to. So in general, I think you can definitely say that it's something that is universal. So for example, when it comes to strengths, so strengths is one of the areas that is explored there, that one of the biggest strength finder tools, the VIA, the virtues and actions strength finder tools, was definitely the authors analyzed documents and texts and studies from all over the world and tried to find sort of common themes and overarching virtues and then associated character strengths that have been highlighted by communities from all over the world for years. So I think you could definitely assume that it's universal. And sorry, I do need to add that there are sometimes, little changes depending on where you're from. So obviously, if you're comparing Western cultures with, let's say, Eastern cultures, so more collectivist cultures. So to give you just one example, one of the common interventions we have is gratitude practice, or also acts of kindness. So one of the practices you can do, for example, is to write a gratitude letter and then give it to your parents, let's just say. And this is just one of those examples that in collectivist cultures tends to sometimes backfire a little bit. So where maybe parents might be of the assumption that, of course, we have always been good parents to you. This is what's expected from us as parents, and it's almost like, why would you ever question that? Why do you need to write me this letter? So there are sometimes nuances depending on where you look, but in general, they apply to everyone.
Talking about different cultures and talking about different nuances, I mean, you've also moved from Germany, meaning Western Europe, into Australia. I don't know if those two cultures are the ones that come to mind first, but would you have examples of differences of understanding of a community, of a society for one particular fact? Because I think the discussion we have always works very fine with examples. What came to my mind immediately was my travels to Japan, but I want to let you talk also. So I don't know, is there big differences between Australia and Germany? Is there other cultures or countries or sub-regions that come to mind when you say, okay, they deal differently with happiness, with gratitude, with strength finding, with reflection, with self-development themselves, the fact that they do take the time?
That's a very good question, and I'd really have to think about it. So obviously, I suppose two different streams of culture that are always often distinguished in psychology are the Eastern cultures and the Western cultures, just because of the difference of me being more collectivist. So maybe things like contributing to the greater good and doing something that goes beyond my own benefits is something that is probably more present in those collectivist cultures anyway. And something like really caring about my own individual growth and accomplishments is maybe something that they might put a little bit more on the back burner. So I think you could find small differences like that, absolutely, but at the end of the day we kind of need a little bit of everything anyway. So we might be dispositioned slightly differently, but I suppose overall, in terms of what the ingredients we need in order to flourish, are probably very similar, simply because we're human beings.
Absolutely. And then another thought that came to mind when you just talked about it is recently, or over the past few years, I listened to different experts on that particular topic, on happiness, on positivity, on communities, and that the world is going from a very individualistic approach rather to a collectivistic approach for the next N years, let's call it, for the next decades. Is that something that you would share? Is that something that you see a shift already happening, or is that something you don't really have an opinion on?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. It's not a thought or an opinion that I've come across much. To be quite honest, I feel like I can see the need for it, definitely. I would hope so. But personally, I observe the exact opposite. I feel like the more we are connected, the more we become lonely, and the more individualistic we live. We don't even live with different generations anymore. So at the moment, from my view, I can only see loneliness increasing, but I hope you're right.
I think the focus or the shift towards a more collectivistic approach, it's exactly the result of what you are describing. So maybe we can drill down a little bit there. Being more connected, being connected all the time, being connected with people from all over the world, you say, has made people also more lonely. So why is that? Or do you have some examples either from general studies or from people you work with, from environments whatsoever, that you are willing to share with us on that?
I can't recall specific studies or anything like that. I know that it's certainly a topic that I think it's just generally probably accepted or discussed in the media. The fact that loneliness is on the rise and has been on the rise since the explosion of social media. Why is that? Well, I'm not 100% sure. It's probably because of the depth and authenticity of the connections. But it's probably also because of things like social comparison. I'm assuming it's very complex. It's not really a topic I usually dive into very much.
No, but it is certainly interesting. Two things that come to mind immediately is, again, Japan, where it's just such a different, I found it a very interesting culture, but it's a very different culture. So I experienced something like that as well. But the original example I want to bring up here is like when I lived in Singapore, which I believe was in 2014, I went into the metro, which are always packed, which are always full, and the smartphones were around then for 6-7 years, so still on the rise. They were not where they are today, but still Singapore, each and everybody had a smartphone. And if you go to a metro, everybody would stare at their smartphone. So I would make kind of a game out of it to look at people and just to try to smile at them and to see what happens. And I realized that some people were in fact not even able to deal with the smile anymore. And some of them felt so uncomfortable that they left the coach or changed their seat and so forth because it was so lonely, So I certainly do agree that this is something that we are experiencing. And I believe that we can just hope, at least, and do our part, that we are going towards a more collectivistic approach as a community. But I think in order to do that, it's also always very important and good to understand yourself and your own strength and your own needs and reflect really. And that maybe brings us back to the topics that you elaborated on earlier a little bit, and that is self-leadership. So maybe you can discuss what is self-leadership?
Yeah, so self-leadership, and I have to say the way I talk about self-leadership is slightly different from the academic literature, and that is simply because I've always seen opportunity to complement it with the insights we have from psychology. It needs to be informed by psychology, and it has been in parts, but I think there was a lot of room for improvement, especially since the positive psychology research has increased so much. So self-leadership is basically the combination of self-knowledge, self-goal setting, and self-regulation. So it's all about identifying who you are, what you need in order to thrive in life, and then guiding yourself there. So that's self-leadership in a nutshell. So it certainly requires a lot of self-knowledge and self-awareness. So that then, based on what it is that you need in life in order to be happy and to thrive and accomplish your goals, that you, based on that, can actually set your goals. I always joke because I'm so over the topic of goal setting, because first of all, SMART goals are everywhere and they have been for years. And it's like, for me, it's like the most boring topic in the world. But I also find it tedious because I think it's such an underestimated topic, because there's so much more to setting goals right than making them smart. People always want to be motivated for their goals. Well, the motivation sits within your goal setting. So you have to understand what motivation is in order to set your goal right. Just to give you one example. So based on your self-knowledge and self-awareness, you need to set your goals. And then obviously we use self-regulation in order to make that plan reality, or that goal a reality. And that is a whole another sort of rise and also ride, and also a can of worms, because self-regulation basically means influencing your own thoughts, emotions, and actions. And we all know how complex that is, right? So things like stress management, focus, cognitive focus, that also went out the door with social media, but also, you know, habit forming, for example. I mean, that's a whole range of skills right there.
And I would be very interested to understand this self-knowledge, which is basically the foundation for self-reflection. Where do you gain self-knowledge, and where have you gained your self-knowledge? Is that something that you described from early on, you knew certain traits and you started to ask questions, but where can people gain more self-knowledge, or why is it important to have this self-knowledge to embark on the journey of life?
Great question. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody is different, right? And depending on who you are, your ambitions and hopes for this one life on earth are also completely individually tailored to you. If you want to live your life the best possible way on your terms, you need to know exactly what it is that makes it perfect for you. So it starts with you. Everything you want to accomplish and hope for in your life starts with you. How do you gain self-knowledge? Well, I suppose some people intuitively maybe know themselves a little bit better than others. I also want to say it's probably something that never has an end per se, because we also change. We do change. Self-knowledge includes things such as our personality. So that is more or less stable, but even our personality can change. Look, there are tools you can use. You can do like a big 5 personality tool to get a profile of your personality. But our self-knowledge includes things like our own beliefs and attitudes. It's fun to explore them, because we are full of them, but we're also very much oblivious to them. So cognitive biases are huge. We have very many of them. That it includes things like our strengths, which I think you've mentioned before. And again, there are lots of different tools you can use. You can also, you know, if I asked you right now, what are your top 3 strengths? What do you think are your strengths? You don't need a test to tell you. You probably have an idea. And if you don't know, ask your best mate. Ask your mum, ask your brother, I don't know, people who know you well and also who you trust, to, you know, be respectful with you. Ask them, what would they say your biggest strengths are? And we need to know our strengths, because when we use strengths to accomplish our goals, not only will it be a lot more enjoyable for us to pursue those goals, no matter how hard they are. And by the way, they are a means to attain flow, the very popular flow state. We will also feel a lot more fulfilled once we've achieved those goals. And we are much more likely to succeed too. So everyone needs to understand their strengths, really. And any person who's ever worked for a company, every company should ensure that their staff have a means to explore their own strengths and a means to investigate how they can use their strengths in order to pursue their goals and accomplish their tasks or whatever. But also, for me, one of the most important aspects of self-knowledge is values. So our core values, because our values are basically the things that are absolutely most important to us in our life. And again, our values are highly personal, and also they can change across the lifespan, and they do, especially when we have sort of big events or big shifts in our lives. But our values are so important because they are like a compass. They give us direction. They don't dictate an end goal, but they are like your needle to happiness and to purpose and meaning. If you want to live a life of meaning and purpose, values are your key, your own values. And values are such a tricky thing. And to be honest, even for me, values is probably the component of, or the element of self-knowledge that has really taken me the longest to understand for myself. Because when you go somewhere and you try to understand your values, or like you're in a workshop and they do like a values exercise, usually what they do is they give you a piece of paper, like A4 piece of paper, and then you have like 30 values on there, and you read freedom, compassion, safety, whatever. And then they ask, you know, tick every value that resonates with you. And then 10 out of 10, you said that. Tick. Safety, sure. Compassion, of course. Freedom, yep, I'll have that. But it's really about your core desired feelings. What is something that really makes you jump out of bed in the mornings, and without placing judgment onto those values, because we do that very quickly, subconsciously. So you can already see I've only mentioned a few, but there are many big constructs when it comes to self-knowledge. And with all of these constructs, they're usually tools you can use. And by the way, I have workbooks on my website you can download and use to explore your strengths, your values, your personality, and everything else. But introspection, write it down, write down your own opinion, ask the people who know you. And observe yourself, how you react to things, what triggers certain emotions in you, and all those sorts of things. So there are many ways to explore your own personality or your own strengths and values. So to observe yourself and get to know yourself, it's not something that happens, from one day to another. And it's also kind of never ending, which I don't say to dishearten anyone, but I think, but it's also an awesome journey, I think.
Certainly it is. I fully agree. And I think once you start getting to know yourself better, there's always the desire to continue learning and to continue learning about yourself. And maybe you put it aside for N months or N years or whatsoever, because you're just very happy and satisfied with what you have. But you may as well, once you've learned those tools, use them again, right? I mean, what you talked about with the strength, I think there is a internal view on your strength, which is your perception of yourself, and then there's the external view of your strength. So yeah, as you say, ask your family members, ask your friends, ask your colleagues, and maybe make an assessment. So you have different perspective on things, and usually you have some common ground from those three perspectives, and usually this is where the sweet spot is, and this is where your strengths are and where you can develop from. And also what you say about the values, I think you have certain values, they can change with drastic life events, but I think still the core set usually stays similar. But the interpretation of values can, of course, change as well. So if you say freedom is your number one value, freedom maybe means something very different in your 20s than in your 40s, but it might still be this very core value that you have that lets you take certain risk, or that takes you there, that safety is maybe not your biggest value. So I really had to grin when we came up with this comparison of those two, because freedom and safety for me are not necessarily uncombinable, but two different values, if you ask me. But that's my personal interpretation of values. So as you said, I think there is a ton of interesting tools, and once you got to know them, you reapply them, and that's the beauty of the game, right? So this is really like understanding and developing and growing from there.
Exactly. And what you can also do, because you mentioned before, or we talked about this now, you can do introspection, you can ask your friends, you can ask your family, your colleagues, take some tests, you can hire a coach. And what a coach can do with you is obviously ask you some questions. So things like, okay, have you overcome a very difficult situation in the past? And what was it that you did that allowed you to overcome that? It's just questions like that. And it really can help for you to dig deep and to be guided by a coach to really uncover those things, because that's often in the past, our past behavior, our past decision making. Why did you do that decision that was really important in the past? What was it? Why did you decide this way and not the other? What was it that was really important to you? And there's your value hidden in there. So I think that's also really good. And one last thing that I wanted to add was that, so we spoke about, core values and strengths and whether they are stable or can change. But also, and asking your family or your colleagues, one thing that I will say is that what sometimes helps is to look at your strength or your values across different domains. So at work, you might have slightly different values than within your relationships, or in a romantic relationship, or for your own, let's say, leisure time or something like that. And a similar thing can be said about strengths as well. So if it helps people to take a more nuanced approach and look onto values or strengths, look across different domains.
Absolutely. No, I certainly agree that there is different strengths to be used and talents to be developed in different circumstances, right? So as you said, you have a romantic relationship or you don't, then you have your relationships with your friends, you have a work, you have yourself, hopefully you have somewhere your finances. So there is different components in life, which different people argue differently about. But I think it certainly does make sense to take a look at least at a second or a third step on understanding how can you interpret your values there and go with your strength. And what you just said about the coaches and the coaching, I would like to use that as a segue to talk a little bit about something you mentioned earlier, and that is about motivation and extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And I just want to ask you, what do you think is the difference of both? And are they both important? Is there more to motivation that we should know about? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a big question. Absolutely, there's more we should know about. And I'm glad you already mentioned intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, because that's usually, sort of common knowledge. People know about those two different things. So intrinsic motivation, when, we do things because we actually love doing them. No one needs to offer us any money. We would like to do them. Extrinsic motivation is when someone offers us money to do something, or, some sort of, when there's a reward to do something that we don't naturally enjoy doing. At the end of the day, what I would like to say is motivation, all that motivation is the mobilization of energy towards a particular behavior. That's all motivation is. People always assume that motivation is the energy that we have for something, but it really is just the mobilization of energy. The energy has to come from somewhere else. And where does that come from? Our lifestyle. Whether or not we sleep and how good quality sleep it is, how much we eat, what we eat, whether we exercise. So all that, whether we take any drugs, drink too much alcohol, all of these things, how we manage our stress, all of these things impact our energy levels. And if you want to achieve anything in life, you need mental and physical energy. So that's just something I'll put aside, because I have so many clients approach me and say, I just can't motivate myself to study or to exercise regularly. And then when I ask them, okay, tell me about a typical day, or tell me about a typical week, it turns out they work full-time, work another job after their work. They have 3 children. They run the household on their own. They basically do everything. And then they beat themselves up at 8 p.m. that they don't feel motivated to go to the gym. So that's the first thing. Motivation, in very basic terms, is the mobilization of energy towards a behavior. It is not the energy by itself. And then we can distinguish intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And the bad news is that whether or not you're intrinsically motivated for something, because this is the gold mine, right? We'd love to be intrinsically motivated to go to the gym every day and just eat healthy food and do, all this work. Whether or not you are intrinsically motivated for something is basically determined, is in your genes almost. It's similar to your personality, is relatively stable, might change, but is rather unlikely. But the thing is, there is more to extrinsic motivation than meets the eye. In fact, there's 4 different types of extrinsic motivation, and one of them is actually very similar to intrinsic motivation. And so we really need to know a little bit more about that. So what is really important in order to achieve something called integrated motivation, which is the extrinsic type that's very closely related to intrinsic motivation, is that, again, we need to understand who we are, our self-concept. If there's a behavior that we don't naturally enjoy doing, but that just strongly aligns with who we are as a person, we will do it anyway without being offered any money. My favorite example, brushing your teeth. Most of us brush our teeth twice a day. It's not something probably that we're by chance or born naturally enjoying so much, but we like mouth hygiene, or we like to be healthy or whatever. Therefore, we just do it. It's become this habit, of course, but it's sort of built on our self-concept. And the other thing, and here we are again, is our values. If we understand what is important to us in life, once something starts having personal importance to us, we will also be more inclined to do it. Prime example, exercising. And I'm just speaking in very, very generalized terms, which I know is not true for everyone, but a lot of people wish they would intrinsically enjoy exercising regularly. To many people, it's not really something that really aligns with their self-concept, even because they don't see themselves as a sporty person. But for many people, it's something that they know is important. It's important to exercise. We know we should be exercising because it's so important for our body and our mind. So chances are that you might go to the gym every now and then. You might not do it so religiously as you brush your teeth or make your bed or keep your house clean or whatever. But it's a key to being motivated to do it at least a little bit. So there are different types of extrinsic motivation. And the good news about that is something we can influence and change. And again, research has uncovered tools, and we know exactly what we need in order to increase our or change that extrinsic type of motivation. And it's something you can work towards.
No, absolutely. And I find that super interesting. So just to summarize, I understand that the intrinsic motivation is something that's basically given with your genes. You're not going to impact it too much. You may tweak around a little bit, but basically the intrinsic motivation you have for yourself is what Maike likes, and the intrinsic motivation is what Ishmael likes. But then there is different components of extrinsic motivation, and some of which we can use to make it kind of look like the intrinsic, or if we find the components that are close enough to our intrinsic motivation, that we can also work on them and incorporate certain behaviors into our lifestyle because we think it's important, it's good, it's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. So the only thing I would say is that extrinsic motivation, there are not different components, if you wish, but different types, and they have a different quality depending on how much the motivation is regulated externally to us, because it can be just externally regulated. So think about little kids that are told by their parents to tidy their room. Zero motivation to tidy the room. It's a matter of being punished or, being made feel guilty or something like that. I'm just talking extreme terms, but little kids having to tidy their room, having been told by their parents to tidy the room. Okay. But then now think of this scenario where the little kid has a brother or a sister, and that bloody brother or sister just keeps the room tidy all the time, and they know exactly how important that is to the parents, and every time they tidy their room, the parents go, "Oh, that's so well done, la la." Of course, now there's a little bit of personal interest, isn't there? So we switched on a flick a little bit, because it has gained a little bit of personal relevance. So now you're sliding slowly up the scale or this continuum of extrinsic motivation. And now if we add personal importance, that let's just say we know it's important to have a tidy room because it makes us think more clearly and then perform better at work, whatever. We're sliding up a little bit that continuum. And if then we at some stage come to the point where we completely identify with tidy people because I'm just a tidy person, bang, here you are at the integrated sort of extrinsic motivation that is very closely aligned to intrinsic motivation. And that is really where the goal is, not to try to become intrinsically motivated, because it's basically more or less given. That's exactly why some people seem to love cleaning and others love, I don't know, doing jigsaw puzzles, and others love doing gardening. And to me, it's just a riddle. But what I do want to say also, what I want to add is that, because I think you touched on that, we can also use a little bit of our intrinsic motivation to see if we can spark a bit of interest for something that we don't feel intrinsically motivated for. So for example, if you love listening to music and let's say you hate studying, well, while you're studying, just turn on your favorite music if that still allows you to do cognitive work. You can do that to kind of improve that situation for you and put you in a little bit of a better state motivationally, if you wish. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. So you can basically combine different activities, one of which you really like, which is further up the ladder, if you want to say, on the extrinsic motivation style, and one that you may want to have a little bit further incorporated into the everyday life, right? So I think the benefit is really to plug and play and to experiment and to see what works. And maybe studying with music really does not work, even though you thought it's the best idea. But it may as well end that 2 hours a day you enjoy studying a new subject if you only have that background music playing. So I think it's really also a little bit of trial and error and experimenting what works, because again, I think this is very individualistic. I mean, there is different traits that work for you and there's different traits that work for me. And I think that example also with the kids and cleaning up a room was just brilliant, and that really helps me and also will help the audience to get those different styles of extrinsic motivation. And let's assume that we've done quite a bit of self-work, at least initially. So we know our values, we know our strength, and we understand what motivates us, and we understand what does not motivate us. And now I would like to go back to the goals. And I don't know if you can or if you want to comment on that, but is there some certain goals of Maike that you can share with us? How do you construct your goals? What is your personal desires that you have, and how does a goal of yours look like?
Wow, I wasn't prepared for that question. It's a funny one because I've noticed with myself over time. Look, you mentioned trust in the beginning, self-trust, and I loved that you mentioned it, because to me, over the years, I've come to learn to trust myself. And this, and also obviously over the years, as you practice all of this, you get to know yourself quite well. So when I work with clients, depending on where they are in their journey, but let's just assume they don't know a lot about the self-leadership model, they don't know a lot about maybe themselves, or, you know, they've done some tests in the past, but if I ask them, okay, what are your top 3 values, they wouldn't be able to say, or what are your top 3 strengths, they wouldn't be able to say. And maybe also they know about SMART goals, but they don't know about motivation. And also they don't know about happiness. And this is probably something I maybe need to mention first. And that is because I put it into my goal setting or into my whole model too. And this is where the positive psychology science comes in, because as human beings, I found this really interesting. We are very good at estimating how happy we are. So if you ask me right now, on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy are you, Mike? And I might give you an 8. Then you can probably rely on the fact that I'm actually sitting on an 8, sort of emotionally or however. And this might sound a bit funny, but we're not always good at estimating all these things about ourselves, okay? So we're pretty good at estimating how happy we are, but we're pretty crap in estimating or anticipating what we need in order to be happy. So we're so crap at that researchers have defined a term for that, and that's called miswanting. So what that means is that we strive for things because we know they will make us happy, and then we get there, and then we experience an anticlimax. We've achieved our goal, and it's like, and then we feel like we're in a vacuum, like, now what? And it's not the party feeling that we thought we were going to have. So something else that's really important to consider when you set your goals is to know what actually makes you happy and what you need in order to be happy. And again, here we're talking about a flourishing model that in general applies to us all, but what it means translated into your own terms, into your own life situation, and especially based on your own strengths, based on your own value, and everything else is highly individualistic. So also what you want to focus on. So if you're aiming to, for example, create more wealth, let's just say financial wealth, but your relationships, are burning, like there's nothing there, in a really bad state, or your personal growth is in a really bad state, I would always prompt and encourage to look at other areas that might be burning first to get a little bit of balance in there. And this is apart from the fact that we know financial wealth doesn't make us happy from a certain point, but that's another discussion. So I'm saying all of this because when I work with myself and set my own goals, I know about happiness. I know also I'm pretty clear on my values. We always have to check in again after a few years, or if we notice things change, but I'm acutely aware of my values. I'm acutely aware of what I need in order to flourish. I'm acutely aware of how I function in terms of my motivation levels. And I've specialized, I did a PhD in human behavior change. So in terms of forming new habits and all those sorts of things. So I don't usually sit down and go, okay, how does my goal that I think I'm striving for align with positive psychology research? Or how does it align with my self-concept? Or how does it actually match my values? Usually my goals form out of all of that sort of organically and in a very fussy and not very defined way. And once I have those goals, because again, I know how my motivation works and how I can, for example, habit stack, establish new habits, I tend to probably just go for it. And I know, though, then it comes down to self-regulation, but that's obviously a whole nother part. So for example, with me, I know that I'm a little bit like a little puppy dog. I get overexcited once I've got something new, and because it aligns with my strengths, with my values, I get so excited about it that I tend to wear myself out. I work too many hours. I might skip some things that I know are important because I just really want to continue. I'm in the flow. I am highly intrinsically motivated, or highly sort of extrinsically motivated, if you wish. So for me, other topics become more important, but I also let myself go with it. And because I know I can trust myself. If I come off track, I know I'm monitoring myself, and I know I'll notice it. I know I won't tell myself stories. So we can talk about cognitive dissonance theory and those sorts of things. Self-sabotage, I know I don't do it. Or if I do it, I know I won't do it for long, because I'll sort of be able to call myself out on it and then change. Because if there's one thing I love, it's efficiency. Very German in that way. And if there's, telling yourself stories that just aren't true is just the most inefficient thing to life. So that ain't happening with me. I can tell you some goals I have, but I can't tell you how that I go about goal setting in the sort of picture book way that I might help someone else learn who hasn't gone through that process before and doesn't have that background knowledge.
No, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, it doesn't have to be this rigid process that you go through and you take 2 days and you take 4 hours for this and then you reflect. And I think goals can come naturally if you're at a certain point in your life or at a certain point of your self-development journey, which you apparently are. And still, it would be interesting for me to understand to which extent, or how did you create this self-trust, and how does it relate with authentic happiness, if you want to say? Because you said you have a good understanding for what authentically makes you happy, but I believe that this has been a journey of multiple years. So what is tools, what is techniques that you can share with people? Is it like to follow their gut? Is it to listening to their heart? Is it to really do this self-knowledge in the beginning and then go from there? So what does it take to create this self-trust and this self-assurance, if you will?
All of the above. Everything you just mentioned and probably more. So as we if we reflect on what builds trust with other people is, probably exposure to those other people is the first thing, exposure over time. And you need that exposure with yourself. So, and if over time you notice that, for example, you want to, let's just stick with the example of exercising, you want to exercise more and you set goals around it, and then you continuously find yourself not doing it, your self-trust will go out the door. Right. But if on the other hand, and that doesn't mean that if we once don't go to the gym, it's a disaster, it's a failure and so forth. So we also need to learn to trust ourselves with that. I think, so we need time and we need to self-monitor. So self-monitoring is a big one when it comes to self-trust. So just looking at how much do your ambitions and your goals and your plans for your own behaviors, because we should always focus on our own behavior, how much does it align with what we're actually doing? And if there's lots of congruence, you will automatically learn to trust yourself, especially when we fail every now and then, and again, and I have to learn all of these things, and as I said, it's never it is a never-ending story as well, because everything fluctuates in life, and sometimes we're better, sometimes we're worse with things. But I think not giving up on ourselves, and even when we fail, and especially when we fail, if we can come back on track, and we can learn tools to do that, we will learn to trust ourselves over time. But it really takes a lot of introspection, and especially almost like psychological introspection, if you wish, because it's that whole telling ourselves stories. And this is where humans are just very problematic, in a way that we always think we're these rationally thinking human beings, and we're so far from it. We have so many cognitive biases or errors in our thinking that we aren't even aware of. And one of my favorite sort of phenomena in psychology is this thing called cognitive dissonance theory. And that's basically the fact that, speaking of motivation, we're highly motivated to have alignment between our behaviors and our self-concept, how we think about ourselves as a person. So just think, you're someone, you would describe yourself, a sporty person, for example, but then you don't actually ever exercise. Well, then something doesn't make sense. And when we have those situations where our behaviors don't align with our self-concept, we are highly driven to change that. Was because we will feel cognitive dissonance. It's uncomfortable. It's like, you always say you're vegetarian, and then all of a sudden you go to one of the fast food restaurants and eat a burger, and maybe you can get away with that because you're going on your own and you're hiding, and somehow you manage to bury it in your head that what's going on right now. But if someone sees you, then it's there, right? You can't hide it, and then it's like it's deeply uncomfortable. You have to get rid of that discomfort, and we can do that by changing our behavior, right? We stop eating that burger and we go back to our vegetarian diet. Or to stick with the other example, we start exercising regularly, or we can change the way we think about our behavior. So for example, when it's just one burger, right? It's just one burger, and it's just, or we can change the way we think about ourselves. So it's like, oh, you know what I really sort of mean maybe is more, I usually eat very healthily, mostly plant-based, but every now and then a little bit of meat is okay. And this is the big problem, because when we start, and this is also where self-trust is so important, because we need to be able to distinguish when we're telling ourselves stories in order to get rid of this cognitive dissonance, and when those stories are actually true. And that is a question only you yourself can answer.
Because nobody else from the outside can understand what's going inside of your head, right? So what is happening that you are going for this fast food chain restaurant and eating that beef burger, or what is happening that you are actually not continuing with the habit? But what you talked about, also habits and habit stacking, brought up another thought, and that is basically, again, that you can experiment and play around. So if you want to be the Maike that really would wish to have this certain habit, and you start doing it, but you really do not enjoy it, and it really doesn't feel like the right thing to do, then maybe after a month trying different scenarios for that particular habit, it's also fine to accept that this is a habit, or that this is a lifestyle component that doesn't suit you well, right? So even though you may wish it would be there, you figure out that this may not be the new sport that you want to get into, because it just doesn't give you enough joy to be consistent, right? Because it doesn't mean going to the gym every day doesn't mean that you're motivated to go to the gym every day, but it's that you are consistent, and that you should enjoy most of it, I would call it, or 80 or 85%. I don't know if you really want to give it a percentage here, but I think it also gives you, the idea to trial and error, and to experiment what works and what would you like to work, and what really does work for yourself.
Absolutely. And again, we come back to self-trust a little bit there too. Knowing that you can try those different things, and it's not a way for you to find a way out of it or something like that. So absolutely. And I think, adaptability and flexibility, or being agile, or whatever you want to call it, has always been for humankind probably the biggest quality, or quality, I suppose we can have, and and adopt. So absolutely, trying different things that work for you. And because you were talking about it, if you're finding that you're really not enjoying it, so here we are talking again sort of a little bit about sort of that whole extrinsic motivation. So in order to move yourself up that scale of extrinsic motivation, though, too, so there's 3 ingredients we need, and I'm using this because I was a bit unhappy with myself for not mentioning it earlier. I hate giving only half a picture of information. The 3 ingredients we need in order to do that are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So I know this sounds a bit strange, but this is more or less the key to moving yourself up that continuum. And I would say you can then tweak, some of these elements. So autonomy is how much of a say do you have over an activity. So for example, if we stick to the gym, you want to exercise, but the exercise classes you like, they're only offered at one day in the week or whatever, and then you just can't really get yourself to exercise regularly. We'll see if you can find a different gym or something like that, so you have more say over when and where you can do it, or at what level, or something like that. Competence, speaking of level, competence is if it needs to be matched to your skill level. If something is too easy or too hard, it's not, you'll lose interest very quickly. So playing around with that. And relatedness is a funny one, because research shows that if we can do something together with other people or for other people, and maybe even serve a bigger purpose, again, it'll motivate us more. So we'll have the ability to slide up that continuum more. And again, we can tweak those 3 elements. When we try something and we find that it is not really hitting the sweet spot for us, we can play around with those 3 elements and see if we have more luck with that.
No, absolutely. That's super interesting. And I just had to think about myself. Like, I travel around myself. Freedom is one of my biggest values, as we've also discussed in our get to know each other conversation. And I, for example, since 2.5 years, don't go to the gym anymore, but I do calisthenics outside. So I have huge autonomy, because I don't care if there's an open gym, and I don't care where I am. I can do it on a playground, I can do it on a sports ground, I can do it really everywhere. And I have like all those different components. And as you said, I think you can check all your different habits or all your different activities and tweak around with that. So I think that's very helpful that you mentioned those 3 components in order to tweak around with extrinsic motivational factors to climb up the scale. That makes perfect sense. Very good. All right. I'm looking a little bit at the time, because I know that you have different duties for today, Maike, but I think we've touched a lot of ground. But is there something that comes to mind that you would really like to talk about before we wrap up, that we haven't given enough notice so far today?
No, I think there are so many things, and as you can already tell, even with flourishing, what we need in order to flourish, there's different cans of worms we can open. With self leadership, there's all these different cans of worms. And I think we actually, as you said, we covered a fair bit of ground, which I'm surprised we managed to do in this time frame already. So I think I'm quite happy. But obviously, where to find me, and if there are any other questions from any of your listeners, or you know where to find me. I mean, they are most welcome to contact me, but yeah, you can do the same anytime.
No, absolutely. And that maybe brings me to a question before we sum up, and before I have a few questions that I ask each and every of my guests. Maike, where can people reach out to you, and where can people find out more about yourself? I will obviously link all that in the podcast description as well, but maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, obviously my website, so drmaikeneuhaus.com, which I'm glad you'll spell that out, because it's a nightmare in the English speaking world. So my website, and then I'm quite active on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. Maike Neuhaus, and then I'm on LinkedIn, and you'll find me on Facebook, but they're sort of like that. I do have accounts on TikTok and Twitter as well, but I'm not really that active there. But yeah, my website and Instagram and LinkedIn are probably a good starting point.
Wonderful. And I will link all that. And I mean, my name is Ishmael Vondergarten, and that's a true nightmare for spelling as well. So I know what you're talking about. But wonderful, because, yeah, as you said, I'm more than sure that my audience will reach out, that they are interested. And yeah, we talked a lot, but I think there's also so many other topics we can continue to talk on. So we may or may not choose to have another episode sometime in the near or midterm future. And I would really love to host you again.
Awesome. Thank you.
And yeah, I really want to acknowledge you also for what you do and for the value that you create for the world, and that you help so many people finding themselves, reflecting on themselves, and living happier lives. And that brings me to 3 questions, Maike, that I ask each and every of my guests. The first one, which might be a little bit obsolete, but I will still try, is what influenced and motivated you the past week?
What influenced and motivated me the past week? That's a bad question, because last week I spent in Melbourne with a friend. So, what motivated me? Coffee. um, yeah, so last week was not an average week for me. I don't know if you want to talk about a different week, but
I think that's perfectly fine. I think it's also good to understand that there is different weeks, and if you have some leisure time and if you have some vacation, you might be motivated spending some time with your friends, because this is something super important as well, right? To nurture our personal relationships, and this is a very good motivating factor. At least for myself, I also really value my friendships. And if you have some good time with friends or with family or with whomever, I think that's a very reasonable answer. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you. You summarized that very well. Thank you for justifying my coffee with friends.
Absolutely. Anytime. Maike, a second question is, who are your mentors, or whom do you look up to personally?
Oh, another fabulous question. It's usually parts of people or features of people. So what really inspires me, so I don't have any gurus or anything like that. I engage a coach myself, or sort of different coaches, and it's usually features. And so, for example, the friend I met last week as well, I said to her, what I love is when I meet people who are brave enough to walk their own path. Despite, regardless of what society tells us what life needs to look like. I think what really doesn't inspire me is when everyone lives the same way and get stuck in the hamster wheel and they don't know how to escape. And it's very sad. I actually feel very sorry for that. And I feel very privileged that I'm not in that anymore. Although I've worked really hard and I've sort of built everything from scratch myself as well. But that's to almost give you the opposite answer, or answer to the opposite question. What really inspires me is when people walk their own path, and when they're determined and they have the introspection and they go for it. It's I find that very courageous, and it's always something I look up to. And it doesn't always transpire to living a grand life. It can be a very average, very quiet, like average and quiet life, quote unquote. But that's what inspires me.
Absolutely. Amen. I would fully agree on that. Thanks for sharing that perspective. And the third question, Maike, I have is that I would ask you to imagine yourself traveling in space all by yourself for quite a few months or even years. And after a long travel, you encounter a human-like species. And before they decide whether or not they want to get to know humanity, they can ask you a few questions. But they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity. So what do you share with them?
Ability to grow, love, and energy. This sounds so weird.
It does not.
But
It sounds
I like
wonderful.
it.
I absolutely like it as well. And with that, Maike, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And I'm already looking forward to invite you again to the Just Another Mindset podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Ismail. It was an
Thank
absolute
you.
pleasure chatting with you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Be yourself positive. Just another mindset.